Well, is the education system in the West on its last legs? Is there any point in sending your kids to a public school or even a private one for that matter? Should we be homeschooling everyone? Because there's no doubt that education in the West is under pressure and under the microscope. Too much money, too little money, too much admin, too little core subjects, too much political correctness and social engineering, too little desire to teach kids how to think instead of what to think.
Well, that about summed it up, Dave. I think that's a lot of issues that people raise. You've just raised there. But just as in everything in the moment in the West, education is being hit by rapid social, economic and cultural change. You'll notice that COVID-19, globalism, protest movements, education, political theories, all these things are in constant tension, and we are in an age of rapid discontinuous change, and education's been swept up in that. It's a key place, however, where much of this conflict is being played out, because education plays a huge role in shaping and forming where we're headed for the future. Well, the decision last week to downgrade the final year exam results of thousands of British students after a COVID lockdown sent the whole education system pear-shaped for several months was met with anger and frustration. COVID-19 is playing havoc with classrooms, and so the Education Department in the UK, in its infinite wisdom, decided to have a crack at sitting the results itself. And the results of that were a clear fail. So have a watch of this clip where someone in charge owns up to doing something wrong and having to sit in the corner wearing a dunce cap.
Of course, incredibly sorry for all those students who have been through this. When we came up with the system, which was broadly supported across the spectrum of calculated grades, what we were doing is to ensure that we have the fairest possible system, making sure that we look after the interests of all students. But when it became apparent that there were unfairnesses within the system, is the right thing to act. So over the weekend, it became clearer to me that there were a level of the number of students who were getting grades that frankly, they shouldn't have been getting and should have been doing a lot better. And the evidence, both from Ofqual and other external bodies, was apparent that action needed to be taken.
So it's right that the government has finally made this U-turn, but you can't mask the frustration and anger and distress that this has caused thousands of young people and their families. And so, yet again, what we're seeing is a government that is slow and incompetent.
That is fascinating, Steve. Is it proof, a sign that the government doesn't have a clue about education?
Well, it's hard to say whether the government has every clue about education, but when you have a system, and I think in the UK more so than in other Western nations, where everything is nationalised and there are very few school systems outside the public one, or I guess the government one, it's very hard to hold these things together. It's hard for the government to be running everything on time like trains and doing education. And it feels like there's an unwieldiness to the education system and the way we channel people through certain sets of results for university entrance that just no longer sort of correlates with how the modern world's working. That's what I'd say at the moment anyway. I think Australia's different at some level, but it's a pressure across the Western world about how we educate people.
Yeah, and I mean, that particular subject, if you like, of exam marks being done by algorithms is, to me, is just absolutely appalling. Not on it, the ability of any child who's doing the work. That for me was just shocking. So that would indicate to me that there's something wrong with our education systems in the West, which you've said. So what should be the role of education in our society, and who should be doing it?
Oh, big questions and big comments that, big fighting conflict areas there as well. I think there is something wrong with the education system, and I read a great line that said, people say our education system is failing us. He goes, no, we're actually getting exactly what we would anticipate from the education system we have. I think there's a tertiary level, there's certainly a system that just, at one extreme, is pushing such an ideology of hard politics. And on the other extreme is just creating people who are fitted out for a job who don't have to think through processes. I think what's happened with the education system in general is that it gets hijacked by strong vested interest groups that want to get to people at a time when they're most sort of malleable, I suppose, for ideas. So I'd want the education system to be forming people who are critical thinkers, but I don't think it's actually doing that. I think it's giving us a bait and switch that's what it wants to do, but in the end, it's about certain pro rata performances and it's about certain ways of groupthink that I think aren't very helpful.
Yeah, so it's like a form of social engineering or social conditioning, plus also a way of setting up people as commercial units to work in particular posts. And education in and of itself as a value is not being accepted. What can we do better? It's easy enough for us to sit and gripe away, grumpy old men, but what can we do better?
Grumpy, not so old man, and grumpy older man, yeah. Well, I think in one sense, what you could do better is you could diversify the education system. You'd have to say that a monopoly on how things are done has never really worked out well for any aspect of society, apart from the Monopolies Commission, perhaps, of which there's only one. But the education system needs to be a little bit more diverse and a little bit more free around the edges, and not assume that, especially with young children coming through, that everyone is a cardboard cutout, that everyone is a cookie cutter, and that teachers are there to just find the median student, because I don't think such a student exists. At the same time, I think there's not enough room for genuine inquiry, and both left and right of politics, and at the moment it's left in ascendancy in the cultural setting in schools, are pushing a much more political aspect onto education. But at the same time, in university settings, you get this huge administrative beast, which is just about churning people out for jobs. And I think both those things are part of the problem. And if we had a system that was much more malleable and suited to training people for knowledge who want to be trained for it, and training people for jobs who want to be trained for it, and some sort of way of, shaping and forming people in a more holistic way, that'd be fantastic. That sounds like a pipe dream.
Well, but you got to aim for it, because education is so important. Steve, I mean, we've talked about this before, and I'm going to let you mention the 2 podcasts that we did so that we can point people to those. I'm going to do a bit of shameless self-promotion as well. I've just recorded a podcast, my quantum podcast, again on education, and people can go to that. There are numerous articles because we regard it as supremely important. It's a big part of what Third Space is doing, that we are very, very concerned about education and want there to be the best education system possible. And we don't have all the answers. I'm not even sure we have a tenth of the answers, but maybe my last question to you, can this system be redeemed, or do we need to start all over again?
Good question. I think the future of education has to be seen that education systems need to be not bound by government overreach. I think part of the issue for me is that education systems should be mediating institutions between the smallest unit of society, the individual, and the largest unit of society, the government. And I think education has to be a little bit more diverse. So online learning, homeschooling, COVID has certainly shown us that those things are possible. It could be that we strip back some of the huge amounts of administrative frameworks that we have around our universities, and also that we don't allow our education systems to push people into one-track thinking, whether it be in politics or whatever, which seems to be happening. Can it be redeemed? Yes, it can, but I think it needs to take a humbler understanding of what education is for and realise that it needs to be in partnership with families, with other sections of the community, rather than just a unit by itself that's discrete and doing something itself.
Okay, it's not an industry. There's some wisdom from Book of Proverbs, and then I'll say goodbye after reading this. And Steve, you can then give us a wee call to action. Start children off the way they should go. Proverbs 22:6. And even when they're old, they'll not turn from it. Well, see you next week, Steve.
Yeah, will do. I think that's a promise and a threat, or a curse at the same time. If you start children off one way, they'll go that way. So education becomes very important at that stage. So we need to take seriously that we're always being educated into something and perhaps away from something else. And I think if we take education more seriously over the next 20 years, we won't have done a bad thing. So I'll see you next week as we think about those things. Don't forget our 2 podcasts on education at the Eternity Podcast website.